Now let's take a look at the other half of the design view, which is the field properties. Let's go back to Customers, enter Design View again. And now you can see that we have our formatting part of the window up here where we enter our field names, data types, and descriptions. The field properties that sit below, this is a special set of parameters that define each one of these data containers with a lot more detail. There are 10 different field properties, and more or less field properties are going to appear depending on the specific data type that you've selected. I'm going to leave the account number alone for a moment and jump down here to last name. Now you see with the data type of text, we have a lot of different options down here in field properties. The first one being field size. And I'd like to point out now, if you tap the F6 key, you'll move from the formatting part of the window down to field properties. So here we are with field size. Well, we learned from looking at our data types that a text field can hold between 0 and 255 characters. By default, when you create a text field, it limits your field size to 50 characters. Why would I want to limit my field size? Well, that argument goes back to the same reason why you choose a specific data type. Some data types allow you to manipulate your information mathematically or using currency formatting, and that's why you choose the data type. But as we discussed, even within the specific numerical formats, you have different sizes, and you choose those various size containers to control the growth of your database, to make sure it doesn't become bulky and clumsy for no particular reason. Not choosing an 8-byte data container when you can get away with a 1 or a 2-byte data container, that's going to save you a lot of information in the end. Well, this is the same argument. Although a text field can handle up to 255 characters, you can limit the size here, also reducing the amount of waste on your hard drive with this particular field and speeding up the processing of your database. What you have to ask yourself, and more importantly your end users, is what are typical pieces of data for this field and what is the absolute limit that you want to accommodate here? Some last names, especially if they're hyphenated, can be really lengthy. So you don't want to limit this to, say, 20 characters just because a lot of your customers are named Smith. When you do receive a customer with a longer last name, their name will be truncated at some point. You won't be able to type in all the characters, and that's not very fitting, especially if you're trying to print out a receipt for them and their last name doesn't even appear. I'm going to go ahead and leave this at 50. But for first name, first names tend to be a little shorter than the last name. You can get lengthy first names. There are some people that do have hyphenated first names, but 50 characters is excessive. So I'm going to reduce that to 25 characters. The next field in our field properties is format. The information that can be contained here will describe for Access how to display the data that's in the field above. So for example, if we wanted all of our names to be in uppercase, we could control the formatting here to instruct Access to always display the information in uppercase. It doesn't really change the way it's stored on the hard drive, but the advantage is the end user doesn't have to type in any particular layout for the text, and it will always be converted to uppercase. There are other advantages for formatting as well, depending on the data that you're capturing. Let's move down to the phone number, for example. Well, with a phone number, if you're going to capture it in traditional format, you're going to open it with a parentheses. You're going to have a 3-digit area code, close it with a parentheses, leave a space, 3 more digits, add a dash, and then 4 digits. Well, if you do the math, the numbers alone equal 10 characters. Then you have your dash, that's 11, the space, that's 12, spaces need to be counted, and the opening and closing parentheses around the area code, and that's a total of 14 characters in order to represent a number in a traditional format. So you can limit this field size down to 14 characters. We don't need to specify any particular formatting, although it seems obvious that you do want a particular format when you're viewing the information, but it's not the format that we want to change now, it's the input mask. An input mask limits the way information is inputted into that field, and it also can give you a head start. For instance, we can set up the opening and closing parentheses and the spaces and dashes exactly the way we want them so that our end user only has to type in the phone number itself. Well, we can do that manually and begin entering that information, or you can move over here. So click this button to bring up the Input Mask Wizard. And it requires that we save this table before we begin, so we'll say yes. And here's the Input Mask Wizard. And as you can see, the very first value is for phone numbers. So obviously this was meant for things like phone numbers, social security numbers, zip codes, etc. There is an extensive list of characters that you can use to build your own input masks, and I'll include that in the extras folder for you so you have a nice table of information. But in this case, we get to simply input our information. And down here we can even try it. So let me just move my cursor out of the way. We can see exactly how the input mask is going to look. And you see, all I had to do was input the 10 digits in my phone number. I didn't have to worry about the parentheses, the space, and the dash. So I'm going to say yes. Let's use that. Go next. And here we have a chance to customize the input mask. Excellent, but we don't need it. I'll say finish. And here we have an input mask now. And you'll notice there are three parts to this expression. The first thing I want to point out is the exclamation mark at the beginning of the input mask. That exclamation mark indicates to Access to fill this value from right to left instead of left to right. Do you see how that makes sense? If I'm typing in a phone number and the person has not given me an area code, or I don't need the area code because it's a local number, I can simply enter the first 555-1234. And it's going to start in this right-hand 0 and move to the left as I enter more digits until it fills up just the values that I've given it. That's excellent. When we see the semicolon is the first divider. So the first part of the mask describes how the information is going to be formatted. In the second section of the input mask, after the first semicolon, it describes how the information is going to be stored. This is waiting for a binary value. It's waiting for a 0 or a 1. If you enter a 0 after the semicolon, then it's going to store the field exactly the way you see it here, including the parentheses, the spaces, and the dash. If you input a 1 after the semicolon, or you leave it blank, the way you'll see it here, it is completely blank, then it's going to store just the numerical data that was entered. So if I've entered a value of 818-555-1234, that's the information that's going to go into the table in the database, and this, with the parentheses, the space, and the dash, is simply the way that it's going to be displayed. Now, after the second semicolon is the third section of our input mask, and this describes how Access is going to treat blank spaces. So if I, as a user, have left spaces in the information by pressing the space bar, it's going to use the underscore that I have here to represent those spaces. It's valuable to have a character in there when I hit the spacebar as opposed to leaving it completely blank so that Access knows and the end user knows exactly how that information was entered. And those are the three parts of the input mask. Let's go down and look at the next field property, and this is caption. You can see as soon as I move into the caption field, off to the right-hand side, Access is describing it for us. That blue text over here is a quick description of what this property is used for and how we can go about entering information into it. Well, let me tell you, a caption is a label, as it says here, that is going to be viewed anytime you're looking at an on-screen form or a printed report. A label is something that's completely optional. If you enter nothing in here, then it's going to use the field name from above. I don't think phone 1 is really the caption that I want to see on my reports and on the on-screen forms, so I'm going to enter phone number. Below that we have a default value. Well, the default value allows us to enter in a value that is going to appear if we don't enter anything at all. Or, as soon as we get to that field, the default value will appear, but it'll all be highlighted, so as we start typing, it overwrites the default value. This is a great way to make sure that you have no empty containers in that particular column of your database. For example, if we move down to credit limit, we can place a default value of 0. As you can see, it's already there. A default value of 0 means that there will be a row of zeros for anybody who has no credit limit assigned, as opposed to just leaving that space blank. And next, we have validation rules. Validation rules are a little bit more complex. you can enter an expression here. Let me just click inside this field. And as you can see, there's another wizard that appears, which gives us an opportunity to enter that expression. You enter a validation rule using an expression. This expression logically checks the data that's been entered to make sure that it's proper. Validating your information can be extremely important depending on the circumstances. You can validate to make sure that the data entered matches the data that's available. One of the easiest expressions I can see would be to say, make sure that the data is greater than, and enter a value. Or make sure the data is less than, and enter a value. Then the validation text, and I'm not going to enter any rule for this particular field. The validation text is the error message that's returned back to the end user when the data they've entered doesn't match the validation rule. For example, if we had said that the credit limit must be less than $25,000, because that's the maximum line of credit that we're going to offer any of our clients, regardless of their type. When they try and enter a value over $25,000, this validation text will appear on the screen and will say whatever you tell it to say. You could say simply, credit limits may not exceed $25,000. Add a little formatting here. And there you go. When the validation rule fails, meaning they've entered information that doesn't fit into that field according to you, then that error message will tell them exactly how to bring the data they're entering into conformity. Not every field is going to have an appropriate validation rule that you can apply to it, but once you enter the validation rule builder and look at the various expressions, both mathematical and logical, you'll be able to create validation rules that control the data entry. The last three fields that we see here, required is a yes-no field, true and false. If it is required, then the user cannot leave this field blank. They must enter something in order to move on to the next field, or to close and save this record successfully when they're entering customer information. If you say the field is not required, then they can leave it blank. And I think for this particular example of credit limit, we would leave it at a no, because not every customer will have applied and received a credit limit. Indexing the information speeds up searches, but creates a little bit bulkier of a database. So this is, again, up to you. Some information is going to be used to search very frequently, and that information should be indexed. Account number would be an excellent choice for that. We'll see this in a little bit. And you'd use smart tags to assign specific actions to obtain the data that you're looking to input into this field. Smart tags require another layer of programming that may not exist with every database. It's a new feature to Access 2003, and it leverages technologies like XML. You're not going to be entering a lot of smart tag data unless you've created specific connections with your database and other external data using the smart tags feature. We'll discuss smart tags a little more later on. Let's go back up to a text data type and look at some more of these fields that don't necessarily appear. As you can see here, a couple of new field properties have appeared that we didn't have with our currency type, and that is allow zero length. Allowing a zero length entry is different than allowing no value at all. A zero length character may be something like a space that is non-printing, but it's different than leaving the field blank. And here you can choose to allow that action or not. Unicode compression. This is specific for multilingual databases. Now, it doubles the amount of space it takes approximately to store your database and to store the information, but it makes your database applicable to any language across the board. If you know for certain that your database is only going to be used within your company and that is never going to require multilingual applications, then you can switch the Unicode compression value to no, and that will save you space on your hard drive. The IME mode and IME sentence mode are more controls for multilingual. They apply to Asian language text and are not necessarily something that you're going to have to deal with. And that's a look at all the field properties that you have control over. What you need to do now is move through all of your tables, assign appropriate field lengths, any kind of formatting or input masks that you're going to need to apply. And I frequently enter captions here to make sure that the fields, when represented on forms and reports, appear in a pleasing manner. Again, for phone 2, I may enter a caption of alternate phone, but for city, I really don't need to enter a caption because city is concise and it's perfect. You'll go through and enter any default values that will be appropriate for specific fields. And once you've taken care of the bulk of your field properties, you should almost be ready to start entering data.